We are on page 13a, and we are just going to go over a little of what we did yesterday, what we learned yesterday. So we have this debate between Rebbe and the Chachamim. Rebbe says that Kriya Shema is supposed to be in Hebrew, and the Chachamim say Kriya Shema could be in any language. And they both had proofs, and each of the rabbis, each of these opinions had to not only explain what their proof was, but also answer what they do with the other proof. And so we went back and forth because each one has to sort of answer the other proof in order to be able to be, understanding the entire paragraph, the entire obligation of Shema. According to their view, they have to answer up any contradictions. So if their view is that you could say it in any language, they're going to have to answer any hint that implies that it has to be in Hebrew. And if you say it can only be in Hebrew, you have to answer any hint that implies that it could be in any language. So they went back and forth. And then the Gemara asked this interesting question, that if you're telling me that Shema has to be in Hebrew, that implies that everything else in the Torah doesn't have to be Hebrew. And that's why the Torah has to go out of its way to give a source and tell you this has to be in Hebrew, implying that everything else doesn't have to be in Hebrew. And if you say Shema can be in any language, why does the Torah go out of its way to tell you that Shema can be in any language? It must be because the entire Torah is supposed to be Hebrew, and this is something unique where you're getting an exception that it can be in any language. So that was the Gemara tried to figure out, does this show anything? Does this shed light on the rest of the Torah and give any, do we have any hint or any implication that the rest of the Torah would be either specifically in Hebrew or could be in any language? Now, this itself is, as I mentioned yesterday, is really a big discussion. What does the Torah mean? The rest of the Torah could be in any language, or the rest of the Torah has to be in Hebrew. What does that mean, the rest of the Torah? So I mentioned to you that Rashi understands it to mean that you would be able to read, you would be able to read the Torah in other languages. Now, I believe that's, let me pull up Rashi over here. Rashi on our Gemara just says that Bishar kol haTorah b'chol lashon nemra likros. And the rest of the Torah, in any language, it is said to be read. But there is, I believe, a Rashi in Megillah that maybe is a little more clear. Rashi in Saita, there's a Rashi in Masechta Saita that says, Likrois beveis hakneses, that it could be read in the shul in any language, or it would be read. So this is a Rashi somewhere else where Rashi clarifies that he's talking about like a public reading. And what that means is that, there might be a source from this Gemara, at least in its process of thinking, of deciding, there is a thought going on there that maybe you would be able to read the Torah in any language. Now, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean that you would read the Torah, that the Baal Koreh, the person who reads the Torah, would he look at the Torah and translate it by heart? In other words, he's reading the words in Hebrew and translating them into English? Or does that mean that maybe the Torah could be written in other languages? So Rashi's explanation, it's an interesting explanation, but Tosfos has a major problem with it. Rashi itself, again, we're not really sure what Rashi clearly means when he says that the entire Torah would be read in other languages, that there is such a thought going on here. Again, this is not the final halacha. Don't take any halacha from this. We are talking about a thought that's going on in the mind of the Gemara, but it's not the final conclusion. But even a thought of the Gemara is something that has to be a valid thought, meaning there has to be some type of a possibility for it to be correct. You can't have a thought in the Gemara that's absolutely absurd. We're dealing with great scholars who have, where there is such a thought going on. Yes, Ben.
I think that Rashi might mean for your personal reading, you have to read it in different languages because that's the only way you can read. But for a public reading or community reading, I don't think it's applicable because they don't have the nikud that the Hebrew language has.
What is nikud?
The only thing is, Rashi does say the words beveis haklikrois beveis hakneses, to read it in the shul. So we mentioned Rashi.
People do
when they study, they read it. They read it in
shul.
shul.
They read it in English.
So the way you're understanding it,
Hebrew, but the people read it.
So the way you're understanding it, you're talking about a person studying Torah in English. Is that the way you're understanding it? And normally that's done in shul.
Even listening in shul to the Koreh, they still read in English because they cannot read Hebrew. So they don't even look at the Hebrew, they look in the English side.
And so what gives them the fulfillment of their obligation to hear the Torah being read? Is that the fact that they're reading the English or the fact that they're listening to the Baal Koreh read it in Hebrew? Which one is the mitzvah of reading the Torah?
Well, the only way they'll understand it is reading the English side.
Okay,
so
but is that
the Koreh is not going to help them?
It's not helping them, but is they fulfilling the mitzvah? Which one? Which one is making them fulfill the mitzvah?
Both, I think both.
Yeah. Listening, hearing.
It would seem that the listening to the Baal Koreh, the reading it gives them something not to be bored, but the listening is the mitzvah. Just like the Megillah, we're going to have Purim soon. Is a mitzvah to hear the Megillah twice, at night and by day. And even if you don't understand it, I mean, most people know the story more or less, but a lot of people don't know the details of the words, each chapter. So it's the mitzvah is really listening, even though some people are reading the English, which is fine, as long as they're hearing every word and they're reading along in the English, and they might not be up to the same place where the Baal Koreh is. They might be a few lines before. It's hard to know exactly, especially if you don't know Hebrew. How are you going to keep up to the Baal Koreh? But the point is, so therefore, I'm not really sure. You know what I mean? Unless you want to say that the mitzvah of studying Torah, and there is such an explanation in Rashi that it means the mitzvah of studying Torah could be in any language, or maybe it has to be specifically in Hebrew. Yes, Robert.
Okay.
For me, it's a combination of both. In shul, the Baal Koreh will read it in Hebrew. Those of us, whatever country we're in, have the local language there as well in translation. We all know, most of us should, or eventually we all know by heart, the Shema. Okay, it's one of those things that's, it's in us. So we all can say it in Hebrew or respond in Hebrew, as well as read it and say it in English which is our language, because if there was a prohibition or less than good interpretation of reading it in one language, it's like I have a JPS Tanakh, and it's all in English. There's no Hebrew at all. So it would not, let's say, theoretically be kosher if you only had the Torah in English versus it being a hybrid, let's say, of both the Hebrew and the English. But again, it's our responsibility to go to shul and hear and know what the Pasha is being read in Hebrew. And again, and with the cantor, again doing the Brochot and doing the Shema is part of the whole experience of being a religious Jew and understanding our language and and God's language in any case.
Right. So Robert is saying that he understands that it should be you should be able to study Torah and understand the reading of the Torah in English, and also you need to hear it in Hebrew. So you're sort of implying like you see it importance in both. But our Gemara is really emphasizing, at least in the thought process of our Gemara, is saying that there is some type of a option there is some type of an idea that maybe the Torah has to be only in Hebrew, or maybe there's an idea that the entire Torah could be in any language. I should mention there is a Talmudic statement in the Tractate Shabbos, very interesting, because in Tractate Shabbos it says that when Hashem called out the 10 Commandments, he called them out in all the languages, or they were somehow heard in all the languages. Very interesting point that it says here. Let's see. It says here that Rabbi Yochanan says, what does it mean in the verse in Psalms? Let me mute everyone.
Mute people, please.
What does it say what does it mean in the verse in Psalms that Hashem yitain oimer hamavasres savarav? Hashem, my Lord, made a declaration. The heralds are a mighty host. What it means is that every single statement, each one of the 10 commandments that went out of Hashem, from Hashem, was divided into 70 languages. So when it says mighty hosts, it's translating it as all the nations. That when Hashem said the 10 commandments, they somehow turned into the 70 languages. And Hashem did this so that the nations would not be able to claim later, this is Maharshah's explanation, that if we would have had the Torah in our language, we would have accepted it. So that the idea of this Gemara implies that Hashem seems to be saying, not just implying, but saying that Hashem sort of made the Torah turn into the 70 languages. Now there is another statement right after it. It says a brisa of the Devei Rabbi Yishmael, the Academy of Rabbi Yishmael, says that ukepatish, like a hammer, yefaitzet sela, breaks a rock, just like a hammer causes a rock to be divided into many slivers. Also, every single statement that emanated from the mouth of Hashem was divided into 70 languages. So what we see is Hashem did give over the Torah to Moshe in 70 languages. So there is some source about the other languages, but nevertheless, now Tosfos brings that Gemara down. He mentions it. interestingly enough, he mentions it. He says, well, the Tosfos here, this Tosfos has a big problem with Rashi. We have to think about what we're saying here. What are we saying? We're saying that the fact that these rabbis hold that Shema has to be either specifically in Hebrew or it could be in any language, however, whichever opinion they follow. The fact that this is a biblical source to the obligation to say Shema. So again, this is all about biblical law, reciting the Shema. Can it be recited in any language, or does it have to be recited in Hebrew? Now this sheds light upon the rest of the Torah biblically, because here we're talking about the biblical law and a biblical source, and the fact that we have a biblical source says, what does this say about the rest of the Torah? If you're telling me here, biblically, you're obligated to say Shema specifically in Hebrew, you're telling me that biblically, you could say the rest of the Torah in any language. And if you're telling me that here, biblically, it says that you can say Shema in any language, it means the rest of the Torah has to be specifically Hebrew. If here, Shema has to be specifically Hebrew, biblically, that means biblically, the rest of the Torah can be in any language. So what we're talking about is biblically. Now, is it a mitzvah biblically to say the Torah in the shul, to read the Torah in shul? And we mentioned yesterday that it's a obligation that was instituted by Moshe Rabbeinu or Ezra. These are not biblical institutions. These are rabbinic institutions. So how could the Torah be saying, here you have to do it specifically Hebrew, implying that when you read the Torah the rest of the year biblically, you could do it in any language. There's no obligation biblically to read the Torah the rest of the year. So how could that be the meaning of this Gemara? That it's implying something about the rest of the year, not the whole year round in the shul, the rest of the Torah, not the rest of the year. The rest of the Torah could be in any language, or the rest of the Torah has to be specifically Hebrew. The rest of the Torah, there's no biblical obligation for. So Tosfos therefore has two answers. One answer Tosfos says is we're talking specifically about Parsha Zachor, which I mentioned yesterday. Tosfos gives another answer that we're not even talking about a reading in shul. We're talking about certain paragraphs are biblical obligations. Just like Shema, there's an obligation biblically to say Shema every morning and every night at a certain time. So the same thing is there's a mitzvah to say Bikurim biblically. When you bring the Bikurim, the first fruits of the first of the 7 fruits, and you bring them to the Beis HaMikdash, there was a mitzvah to read a paragraph there. It's called Mikra Bikurim. You read about a paragraph there. Arami Yovedavi. It spoke about thanking Hashem for giving us the land of Israel, and that we were homeless, and then Hashem gave us the land of Israel. So there's a paragraph that's biblical obligation. So can that paragraph be read in any language, or does it have to be read in Hebrew? How about Vidui Meiser at the end of the 4th year and the 7th year, that you have to acknowledge that you make a statement that you have gotten rid of all of the Meisers, all of the tithes, and that would be called Vidui Meiser. It's a announcement that you've distributed the tithes to all the appropriate places, the Kohen, the Levi, and so on. And there's also a paragraph that's called Chalitza. What is Chalitza? Chalitza is when, unfortunately, a man passes away without any children. There's a mitzvah for the man's brother to marry the widow. And this way, they will keep on that the family will have a continuity. So that's called chalitza. I actually was once at a chalitza ceremony, very rare to have, but I was once present at a chalitza ceremony, and they actually made sure to say it in Hebrew. But this would be a source. Do you need to say it in Hebrew or not? That would be a biblical obligation where there are a few statements said by the man, the potential husband who says, he's not gonna marry her, then she spits and says her paragraph and takes off his shoe. And so she has a statement that she has to say. It's an interesting ceremony. And then she throws his shoe. And so basically the paragraphs that are recited at the chalitza ceremony, do they have to be in Hebrew? So if we say that the Shema, there's a source that it has to be Hebrew, it says in the Shema, that here it has to be Hebrew, and implying that maybe the chalitza ceremony doesn't have to be Hebrew, and that's a biblical a biblical mitzvah. That, really, they're supposed to be getting married, yibum, and if they don't get married, they do chalitza. I should have explained that a little. Really, they're supposed to marry. The brother is supposed to marry the widow. But nowadays we don't do that, and we give them the option B, which is to do a partial divorce. They're not officially married, but there's some type of a relationship there called zikuk liyibum. There's a relationship that they're supposed to be married, yibum, and we don't encourage it based on the fact that we're nervous that when they have relations that they won't have it, that he might not have in mind the right intention, that he's marrying her for the mitzvah of yibum, and therefore we encourage it. We have them do chalitza, and chalitza is the divorce ceremony where he says he's not interested in marrying her, and that's called that's a chalitza ceremony, and there's statements that have to be read. So the question is, do those statements have to be read in Hebrew or not? And here, this would be our discussion of our Gemara. So these are the three examples that Tosfos gives that are biblical obligations, which the question would be, would they have to be said in Hebrew or in any language? And then Tosfos ends off and he says that however you learn, when it came to Sinai, every word that came out of Hashem was divided into 70 languages. So we're definitely not, our Gemara is not talking about how Hashem gave over the Torah to Moshe, into the Jewish people, into the world. Because there, for sure, it was divided into 70 languages. But it might be still an obligation that we have to read things in Hebrew, just like Shema. According to one opinion, Shema has to be specifically in Hebrew. So in other words, what Tosfos is saying is we're definitely not talking about did Hashem give the Torah in 70 languages, because that we know Hashem gave the Torah in 70 languages. That's the Gemara and Shabbos. That where Hashem gave it, said the 10 Commandments into 70 languages. But the question is, there are other examples where maybe it should specifically be Hebrew, or maybe it could be in any language. Yes, Ben.
I have a question. Why do they use the word divided into 70 languages? Why don't they say translated to 70 languages?
Well,
the Torah is not divided. They transfer the whole Torah.
I use the word, you're asking a question on me, really. Why did I use the word divided? Oh,
I didn't know.
Yeah, it's a good question.
I'm sorry.
And the reason why I use the word divided is because it from the Gemara, it sounds like Hashem said the words, and somehow the words split off into different languages. That's what it sounds like. Just from the wording. You got to open the Gemara Shabbos and read it inside, but it sounded like it was like divided, almost like cracking the rock is sort of like dividing the pieces into 70 parts. I don't know. That's just the term I use, but maybe it's not a good term.
Use spreading. You can use spreading.
It was spread. Okay, we'll use the word spread. Okay. Yes, Robert.
No, I was going to say, Ben was right, but I was going to say it was parceled out in the 70 different languages. But the base of it was in Hebrew. So again, the font, the beginning of it is Hebrew. That allows others to then experience the mitzvah of hearing it and integrating it into themselves. But,
maybe. Interesting thought.
It's a way, unfortunately, most people in the world who are Jewish are not necessarily educated in Hebrew. And consequently, if they don't have it in their local language, they will be lost to us.
Right.
So every effort should be made to then bring them back into the tent.
Right. The only thing is we're trying to fit it. We're trying
I know,
to follow what the Torah says, not what we
but we
think
have-
is it.
Yeah, but
No.
there are two countervailing interpretations. Like clearly over the ages, we have synthesized, again, I've been to synagogue all over the world, and
Right.
the services are always in Hebrew,
Right,
Okay.
right.
in the
Well,
Mama Loshen, if you want to
right.
call it the Hebrew, okay? And then those of us in the congregation who do not understand, or we're traveling as a Jew, and we go somewhere else to a synagogue, and we don't know Portuguese or French or whatever, but we still know the familiar tune, or again, the Shema, or all of the blessings that we
Yeah.
know in Hebrew is the universal religious language of the Jew versus Yiddish,
Right.
okay?
Yeah. No, thank you, Robert. But the thing I just want to mention, I want to emphasize is the fact that one of the mistakes that different groups in Judaism made was that they are trying to find a solution for Judaism not to lose a lot of its members.
Right.
And so they came up that there should be continuity and there should be Jewish identity. They came up with ideas of how to do that, and they want to make certain laws and rules. And the truth of the matter is that the first place to do that, to check that, is through Jewish law. In other words, you can't switch the law because we're nervous. Hashem will
Right.
make sure Judaism continues. We
But
don't
to
have to
fit our
worry.
need. You can't change the law to
We
fit
can't change the
our
law.
need.
So it's very nice that we want, we would love to have more people, but we can't change. So what we're doing in the Gemara here is the exact opposite of trying to find a way to tell people. We're trying to find what the Torah says, what is the law that Hashem gave. You know what I mean? So we're looking at it from a whole different perspective. We're not looking to try to figure out how we can get it to the people. We're looking to see what did Hashem say when he said to say the Shema, when he said to do the Torah, when he said these things, so that's what we're looking at. But I will just read you one interesting thing that they bring from the Sfas Emes here, that the root of all languages in the world is Hebrew, the holy tongue. Hebrew was spoken exclusively until God confused the tongues of mankind at the Tower of Babel. He then distorted the holy tongue in 70 different ways, and 70 derivatives of Hebrew emerged. So all languages are somehow derivatives of Hebrew. These languages were so corrupt that it was impossible to recognize their holy source. At Sinai, God split every Hebrew word he uttered into 70 languages to display the spark of holiness, which is at the core of every foreign tongue. So he split the Hebrew words into 70 languages to show the spark of holiness, which is at the core of every foreign tongue. Now, that itself is an interesting idea, but I will just shed a little light on what that means is that the Hebrew language, we think it's just a simple language that people want to, say that, well, this is a cup. So in Hebrew, it would be called a kais. So kais is a word that if you want to relate to this cup, we'll call it kais. It's not true. It's much more intrinsic. There's an intrinsic connection between this and the word kais. The letter chaf vav samach is actually the divine soul that's holding this cup into existence. There's actually holiness that's causing this cup to be created, the letter chaf vav samach. So in Hebrew, it's actually very clear why this is the word for this cup, because that is the energies, the letter chaf energy, the letter vav energy, and the letter samach energy. These are the energies in the Hebrew language that would cause this to be in existence now. Now, the English language cup really has nothing to do with that. English language using the word cup or mug is just a word, though we know how to relate to it. But it's not the energy of Hashem that's made up from the letter M-U-G, mug.
Right.
However,
physical manifestation of the cup.
Just one second, Robert. In Hebrew, it's intrinsic. And this is what, the Sfas Emes is explaining, that Hashem split the Hebrew words that he uttered into the 70 languages, showing the spark of holiness. From each word, the letters have certain holiness, which is at the core of, in that spark, there's some reason why in English we chose to use Hashem showed the the energy that's somehow hidden in the English words that are causing the cup to be revealed. In any event, Hashem did translate the whole Torah into English and into other languages when he gave the Torah. But the question our Gemara has is about the other mitzvahs. Are they supposed to be in Hebrew, or could they be in any language? I will just mention that there are a few explanations that they want to say in Rashi, and Rashi had told us that the reading in the shul sounded like it was biblical. So number one, and Tosfos argued, said there's no biblical obligation. So number one is that in order to answer Rashi, we're talking about the holiness of a Torah scroll if it was written in other languages, not that it has to be read, but would it be holy? And the truth is, if it was written in other languages, would you be allowed to read it in other languages in the shul? So in other words, we're not talking about actually the biblical obligation of reading the Torah in shul. We're talking about the biblical obligation to write it, or the biblical obligation to honor a Torah. Would it have that holiness? So that is what the Gemara is mentioning. And would you have to put it into geniza, into a special burial, if it, when it's not in use anymore, or it's getting old? Would you have to bury it, or would you be allowed to throw it out? Now that's one answer, one explanation of Rashi. Now there is a Ritva. The Ritva says that really reading the Torah is a biblical obligation, and he brings a source, he brings a proof. So that he's a individual opinion. Most opinions say the Torah reading is not biblically obligated, but the Ritva says it is biblically obligated, and he wants to, that would possibly be the understanding of Rashi. Now, the Gemara says, Tana Rabbanan, V'hayu, the word in the Torah, in the Shema, says V'hayu. And we mentioned that there's two things that you could learn out of V'hayu earlier. One thing was V'hayu, you have to say it the way it is in Hebrew. Another way to translate the word V'hayu is that it has to be in this order. It should be this, and this. These words should be this way, not any different way. You can't read backwards. V'hayu shelo yikru'u lemafreya. You can't read the Torah backwards or say the Shema. Excuse me, we're talking about the Shema. You can't say the Shema backwards, which would mean that you would say Uvi she'arecha, and then Beisecha, and then Mezuzos. You would say the words backwards, or could mean the psukim, the verses backwards. What it doesn't mean is the paragraphs. The paragraphs, we already spoke about that. If you did the paragraphs in a different order, you did fulfill the mitzvah. We're talking about here going backwards. We're talking about the verses or the words. Now it says Hadvarim al levavecha. V'hayu hadvarim ha'ela asher anochi mitzavcha hayom al levavecha. What does that mean? What does that teach us? Yachol tehei kol parsha. You might think that the whole paragraph, Sricha Kavana, needs to have Kavana, which here we're talking about. Kavana means understanding the words. Talmud Loimar, the verse comes to let us hear Ha'ela, that it says V'hayu hadvarim ha'ela. These words should be al levavecha. Ad kan tzricha kavana. Until here, until al levavecha, Rashi says, until here, you need kavana. You need to know what you're saying. Mikan va'elech ein tzricha kavana. From here and onward, you don't need kavana. Divrei Rebbe Eliezer. These are the words of Rebbe Eliezer. Amar le Rebbe Akiva. Rebbe Akiva said to him, Harehu Omer, doesn't it say, and now we turn the page to Yud Gimel Amud Beis 13b, doesn't it say, Asher Anochi Mitzavacha Hayoim? Doesn't it say that I am commanding you today? Al levavecha. That anything that I'm commanding you today should be al levavecha. You should understand. So why are you saying that it only means up to that verse? Mikan atolomed, from here you learn, shekol parsha kula. Again, it says over here, asher anoichi mitzavacha hayom, it says that what I will command you today, which means the future. It's not just going on the past, but it means the future. This is the Tosfos explanation of this Gemara, that it says mitzavacha and not tzivi sicha, since it uses the future word that I am commanding you, meaning what I am going to be commanding you, meaning the next part of the next few verses as well. That is also included, that it should be al levavecha, on your heart, meaning you should understand it. Asher anochi mitzavacha hayom al levavecha mikan atolomed, from here you learn shekol parsha kula tzricha kavana, that the entire Torah portion of Shema, the entire paragraph, I should say, of the Shema, tzricha kavana needs kavana. Here we're translating as the understanding of the parsha. So Rabbi Akiva held that the entire paragraph, and Rabbi Eliezer said only the first few verses. Now, Amar Rabba bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, halacha ke Rabbi Akiva. Rabba bar Chana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva. Ika demasni la aha. There are some that say that Rabba bar Chana, when he said that this is the halacha, you have to have kavana for the whole paragraph of the Shema, he was talking about a different opinion, a different brisa. He didn't say it about this brisa where there's an argument, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. He really said it about a different brisa, a different statement of the Talmudic rabbis, of the Mishnaic rabbis. That what does it say there? The Tanya we learned in a brisa, and this is a Tosefta, which Tosefta has a slight more validity than a brisa. Both of them, of course, we can't argue with, but sometimes the Gemara does find certain changes that it has to make in a brisa if the brisa doesn't fit. It wasn't edited. A Tosefta was a little more edited. Reb Oishia had edited the brisas to put it into his Tosefta. So they're a little more, maybe slightly more edited. So it says, but of course they're not. It's not a Mishnah. A Mishnah is the real edited form of our laws from the Mishnah. The Toseftas and the brisas are considered less of a source, but still a very important, very very valid source. So the Tanya we learned in a brisa, person reads the Shema, he needs to have intent. He has to know, he has to have an understanding. He has to, literally it means he has to direct his heart. Rav Acha mishum Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rav Acha, in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, says, Kivan shekivan libay beparak rishon. Since he had directed Kivan Liba, he directed his heart, meaning he understood what he was saying in the first chapter. Shuv einay tzarech, he doesn't need any more to concentrate and understand. He fulfilled the obligation once he had understanding in the first chapter. Amar Rabba bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, halacha kereb acha. Rabba bar Chana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. On this, he said halacha kereb acha. The halacha is like Reb Acha, Shamar mishum Rabbi Yehuda, that said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda that the first paragraph is important to have for the entire paragraph. So again, we have an argument. There is a first brisa that had an argument, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. How much of it do you have to be part of? Do you have to understand and follow? On that Gemara, one version had it that Rabbi Bar Chana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that the halacha follows the first chapter of the Shema. And then there's another version that had the same idea, the same obligation, the same halacha, that the halacha follows. It's in a different name, the name of Rabbi Acha and the name of Rabbi Yehuda, different opinion, different name, but it's the same point that you have to have kavana for the first chapter of the Shema in V'ahavta. Now the Gemara continues, and it says, Tanya idach, we have another brisa, v'hayu, shelo yikra lemafreya. V'hayu means that it should be this way. You should not read it backwards. Al levavecha, it says, Al levavecha, Reb Zutra Amar, ad kan mitzvahs kavana. Until here, you have to have kavana. You have to understand what you're saying. Mikan va'elech, mitzvahs kriya. From here and onward, you have to say the words. This is Rav Zutra. Rabbi Yoshia Amar, ad kan mitzvahs kriya. Until here is the mitzvah of kriya. Mikan va'elech, mitzvahs kavana. From here and onward is the mitzvah of mikan va'elech, mitzvahs kavana. From here and onward is the mitzvah of kavana. So, what does this mean? Ma'ishna mikan va'elach mitzvahs kriya. Why is it different that from here and onward would it be a mitzvahs kriya d'chsiv ledaber bam? Achanami hochsiv v'dibarta bam. So again, we're discussing there's one thing I should clarify. We're discussing the difference between the first chapter of Shema and the second chapter of the Shema. The first chapter of the Shema, Rabbi Zutra says, you see, it says Al levavecha. That means the first chapter is all about kavana. When we talk about the heart, the bina liba, it says, the heart understands. So the heart is connected to understanding. So when it says Al levavecha, on your heart, it means you need kavana. Where does it say Al levavecha? In the first chapter of the Shema. So Reb Zutra says, the first chapter of the Shema needs kavana. You need to understand what you're saying. Mikan va'elech, from there and onward, is the mitzvah of reading, of saying it. So from there and onward, you don't have to have the kavana. Now, Reb Yoshia said, the mitzvah of kriya is the first paragraph, mitzvah to say it. Mikan va'elech is a mitzvah of kavana. From there and onward, it's a mitzvah of kavana. Now, I should mention that when it says kriya, we understand it means all you have to do is say it. You don't have to know what you're saying. When it says kavana, the Gemara is thinking that it means all you need is to think about it. You don't even have to say it. That's the initial thought of the Gemara. So I'm just giving you the initial understanding. And of course, that's going to change, but that's the initial understanding. So the Gemara asks, "Mai shna mikan va'elach mitzvahs kriya." Why would there be a mitzvah on the second chapter of the Shema to say it? Because it says in the second chapter of the Shema, the d'chsiv ledaber bam, it says there you should speak in them and say these words. Hachanami, here also in the first chapter of the Shema, it also says v'dibarta bam, haksiv v'dibarta bam. So why would you not have to say the words? The Gemara is understanding that all you have to do is understand the Shema. You don't have to actually say it. And the Gemara is saying, but it says in the Shema, v'dibarta bam, you should say these words. You should speak in them. That means speak of them, these words. It sounds like you have to say the words. Just like it says in the second chapter, it says in the first chapter, you got to say it. You can't just think about it and understand it. So the Gemara answers, you're right. Hachi ka'amar, this is what we meant to say. Ad kan mitzvahs kavana ukriya. Until here is the mitzvah of kavana and kriya, meaning you need to say the words and you need to have the right kavana, the right intent, the right understanding. Mikan va'elach kriya b'loi kavana. From here and onward, all you have to do is say the words and you don't need to have the kavana. If you don't understand it, you fulfill the mitzvah anyway. Now the Gemara jumps to the next point. Umayshna adkan mitzvahs kavana ukriya. Why would it be that way? In other words, let's dig a little deeper. Why would it be that here is a mitzvah of kavana and kriya, d'chsiv al levavecha and v'dibarta bam? In the first chapter of Shema, you need both. You need kavana, which is the understanding, and you need kriya, which is the reading, the saying. Why do you need both? Because it says al levavecha, understanding, v'dibarta bam, saying, reciting. The second chapter of Shema also says those words. Hasam nami hoksiv al levavchem v'daber bam. It also says the same words. It says al levavchem should be with understanding on your heart, and it should be ladaber bam to recite the words of the Shema. So you need both in the second chapter as well. The Gemara answers no. The second chapter, it says both of those ideas, but we learn something else out of this when it says in the second chapter of the Shema, it says, al levavchem. The Gemara understands that to mean something to do with the tefillin. And therefore, we aren't going to use those words, it should be on your heart, to mean that you should understand it. We're going to learn something about the tefillin, that the tefillin, the arm tefillin, should be opposite the heart on the lower part of the arm, but the highest part of the muscle of the arm, and that should be opposite the heart, and therefore that's the meaning of the word al levavchem, on your heart. It doesn't mean that you're supposed to understand the second chapter of the Shema. It means it's supposed to have the tefillin on the same, towards the heart. If you would move your arm down, it would be facing, if you would hold your arm down, it would actually face your heart. Even if you're a lefty and you're putting your tefillin on your right arm, and your heart is on your left side, but the tefillin would still be facing the heart. And this is what the Gemara says. Let me read it inside. Hahumi boile, that time where it says al levavchem in the second chapter of Shema is not to teach you that you need to understand the second chapter. It's licha de Rebbe Yitzchak. It's for Rebbe Yitzchak, the Amar, that says v'samtem es devarai ela. You should place these things, which the understanding of Rebbe Yitzchak is that it's not talking about place these words on your heart. It means place the tefillin. And that the tefillin should be opposite the heart. It should be placed, it needs to be placed, keneged halev, opposite the heart. So in the Shema, we read about the tefillin. And not only do we read about the tefillin in both chapters of the Shema, but in the second chapter, it tells you where to put the arm tefillin, because the arm tefillin is unclear on your hand, on your arm. And so it says clearly, al levavchem, that you should place it on your heart. And so that is the meaning of Rebbe Zutra's statement that the first chapter of Shema needs kavanah, and you have to say the words. But the second chapter of the Shema, you can get away with just saying the words, even if you didn't have the right kavanah, even though it does say al levavchem. Because al levavchem doesn't mean that you have to understand it. It means the tefillin should be on your heart. Now, of course, we know that we mentioned there's a mitzvah, biblical mitzvah, to say Shema every day in the morning and in the evening. There's also a biblical mitzvah to put on tefillin in the morning and in the evening. And the biblical mitzvah of tefillin, it should really, while you have the tefillin on, you should really say the Shema together. Why? Because if you don't wear tefillin and you say Shema, it's like you're giving false testimony about yourself. You're testifying how the acceptance of the yoke of heaven, and that Hashem commanded us the Shema, and then you're not even doing it. So in order for it to be not false testimony, person has an obligation to, of course, put tefillin on and say the Shema, and best if he does it together when he has tefillin on, to say the Shema with the tefillin on. If you're missing the time of saying Shema, you should say Shema without the tefillin, and you put the tefillin on later, because the time for Shema nowadays is probably around like 9:40, I believe. So in Florida, so if a person is it's 9:30, he's not going to be able to daven and catch up and do the Shema with his tefillin. So you could just say the Brochos Torah, say the blessings on the Torah, and then say the Shema and fulfill the mitzvah. Or theoretically, if you can't even say the blessings on the Torah, you could just say Shema and not have in mind to fulfill the mitzvah of Torah study, and just say Shema and fulfill the mitzvah of Shema without the blessings of the Torah, even though, of course, that's better to say the blessings of the Torah first. So that is the Gemara that we learned here, is the obligation of till where do you need to have kavana, intent, understand, which we're translating one of the translations of kavana. There's three translations yesterday I mentioned of what kavana is, but here we're talking about the kavana means the general understanding of what the meaning of the words and the meaning of the intent, the paragraph of the Shema, the general intent of the paragraph. And so we mentioned the two opinions. The first opinion that it was just the first few verses, the second opinion the first chapter. And we had it said the halacha is that way, that it's the entire chapter. Then we said that afterwards, that for the first chapter you say the words, and you also have to understand the second chapter. You don't have to understand. And we had the source for it. We asked some questions on the source back and forth, because the second chapter also says Al Levavchem. And we concluded that the reason why it says Al Levavchem is because that's talking about the mitzvah of putting the tefillin keneged halev, opposite the heart. And the idea of the tefillin opposite the heart is that we're supposed to direct our emotions to Hashem. So when we put tefillin on, we're actually supposed to be meshabed halev v'hamayach. We direct our emotions and our thoughts. The arm tefillin is all about directing our emotions to Hashem and directing our thoughts to Hashem every day. We have to make sure to direct our thoughts, that we are subjugating our thoughts and our emotions to Hashem, that we don't want to just do what we like and what we think is good, but we follow what Hashem says, and what Hashem wants us to enjoy and to love. That's what we're supposed to love. So we're directing our emotions to have passion for what Hashem wants us to have passion for, and for us to use our intellect for what Hashem wants us to use our intellect for. I do want to just mention there is an interesting vart that V'hayu hadvarim ha'ela. These things should be Asher anoichi mitzavacha hayom, that I command you, should be al levavecha, on your heart. And then it says right afterwards, Vishinantam levanecha, you should teach your children. So there's a very nice vart that the anything, if you want to impact your children, the only way that you will be successful is if it's al levavecha. If the words that you are trying to impact your children to do, if you yourself are passionate about it, you yourself enjoy it and follow it, then you will be able to influence your children. It says, these words that I command you should be on your heart, and you should teach them to your children. And so the vart is, if it's on your heart, then you'll be able to teach it to your children. If you love it, if you are passionate about it, then your children will pick up on it. But if you're not passionate about it, don't think that you're going to be able to influence your children. I was once at a kiddush where a man was making kiddush for a yahrzeit for his father. His father was very careful to always daven every minyan, every prayer with a minyan. very careful, extra careful. There are certain leniencies once in a while, not to daven with the minyan if you're not nearby and so on. But he was extra careful. So this son, who was making a yahrzeit for his father, he said, listen, I sometimes am at work and this is very hard for me to get out and so on. But I'm hoping that my son, who was standing right there, I hope my son will take after